the spring of 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd threw a stray stone into a dark, forgotten cave opening. He wasn't looking for history. He was looking for a lost goat. But the sound that echoed back out of that darkness changed everything we know about the Bible. What lay inside those jars had been hidden for 2,000 years. The Dead Sea Scrolls, a library of ancient Judaism hidden away from marching Roman legions. But as scholars painstakingly pieced the fragments together, they stumbled upon an anomaly that sent shockwaves through the academic world. For nearly a millennium, mainstream biblical scholars held a deep-rooted textual bias. The Greek Septuagint, the Old Testament translation used by the early Christian church, was flawed. Critics claimed its translators were sloppy, that they had taken wild creative liberties, or worse, that later Christian scribes had actively altered the text to manufacture prophecies about Jesus. But the caves of Qumran revealed a startling truth. Scribes found ancient Hebrew scrolls that were more closely aligned with the Greek Septuagint than the standard Hebrew Bible we have today. The Septuagint wasn't a bad translation at all. It was copied from a preserved, ancient Hebrew text type that had been lost to the world for nearly 2 millennia. This is the story of the lost canon, the 2,000-year war for the Septuagint. To understand how the Bible became Greek, we have to travel back to the early 3rd century BC, to the jewel of the Mediterranean, Alexandria. Founded by Alexander the Great, the city rose to prominence under his successor, Ptolemy I Soter, who established the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. His son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, continued and expanded this legacy. At the heart of the city stood the Royal Library, an ambitious cultural and scholarly project developed under the early Ptolemies, especially Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II. Its aim was to gather and preserve knowledge from across the known world and beyond, transforming Alexandria into the epicenter of learning, wisdom, and research in antiquity. According to tradition preserved in the letter of Aristeas, King Ptolemy II desired a copy of the Jewish law for his great library in Alexandria. The account records that he sent lavish gifts to Jerusalem and requested scholars capable of translating the Torah into Greek. Jerusalem responded by sending a delegation of 72 elders, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. The name Septuagint, often abbreviated as LXX, derives from this tradition of the 70 translators. However, most modern scholars regard the letter of Aristeas as a myth. Alexandria had become home to one of the largest Jewish diaspora communities in the ancient world. As generations passed, many Jews living in the city increasingly used Greek in their daily lives, business, and education, reflecting the broader Hellenistic environment. While Jewish religious identity remained strong, familiarity with Hebrew was no longer universal among the diaspora. This created a growing tension. The Torah, the foundational text of their tradition, was no longer fully accessible in the common language. The Septuagint was likely compiled as a pragmatic response to the Greek-speaking population. Written in Koine Greek, Koine meaning common, it was the common language of many Jews in Alexandria and the Greek-speaking world. Some historians also have inferred that the Torah portion of the Septuagint could have been written to facilitate Jewish self-governance, as having a law translated in Greek could have helped Greek authorities understand and recognize Jewish law. Regardless, many Hellenistic Jews did not view this text as a mere human translation. They hailed the Septuagint as a work of divine inspiration. The first-century Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria wrote that the translators worked under direct prophetic possession, writing as if an invisible prompter were whispering into the ear of each. The legendary Jewish historian Flavius Josephus recorded that when the text was read to the Jewish assembly, the elders declared it so perfect that it should remain altered in no way, and no addition or subtraction should ever be made. Even early traditions within the Babylonian Talmud record the event of 72 elders as an act of divine intervention, stating that God placed wisdom into the heart of each translator so they all agreed to one singular mind. By the 1st century AD, the Septuagint had spread across every corner of the Roman world. It was the everyday Bible for millions of Jews living outside of Israel. And it was into this Greek-speaking world that Jesus of Nazareth was born, and the apostles launched their mission. When we read the New Testament today, we often miss a significant historical detail. When Jesus, Paul, Peter, and Luke quote the Old Testament, they are often not quoting from the Hebrew textual tradition used today. Instead, they are most often quoting the Greek Septuagint. Studies of New Testament quotations have found that more than 2/3 of Old Testament citations and allusions align with the Septuagint more than with the Masoretic text. Core passages of Christian theology, including Matthew 1:23's "A virgin shall conceive," Luke 4:18's "Recovery of sight to the blind," and Romans 15:12's promise that the Gentiles will place their hope in the Messiah, will not be found in the Masoretic, but in the Septuagint. The day the Torah was written in Greek was as catastrophic for Israel as the day the golden calf was made. Masechet Soferim. This adoption of the Septuagint by the Christians, however, triggered a monumental counter-reaction within mainstream rabbinic Judaism. The text they had once celebrated as divinely inspired was now being used to convert thousands of Jews away from traditional Judaism. Additionally, with the failed revolt of the Jews against Rome in 70 AD, Jewish sages felt even more the need to consolidate their faith before it was lost completely. The gatherings at the Academy of Yavna for the next decades are what led to the rabbinical Judaism we know today. Paired alongside these gatherings was a shift in the treatment of the newly formed Christianity. This included the exclusion of Jewish-born Christians from synagogue and communities, and a persecution of Jewish converts for their avoiding of a military draft by Simon Bar Kokhba. Most Jewish Christians fled Jerusalem to the Levant. The last nail in the coffin for the Septuagint, however, was the new Greek translation by Aquila of Sinope. Aquila, a Greek translator heavily associated with rabbinic Jewish circles and Rabbi Akiva's school of thought, was commissioned to translate a Greek text from a completely different textual tradition, a tradition becoming increasingly adopted by rabbinic Judaism. This tradition was the predecessor to the Masoretic text used today known as the proto-masoretic. This new Greek text followed a completely different textual tradition from the one that had been used by Jews for centuries, avoiding many of the messianic prophecies used by early Christians for their conversions. The Septuagint, in the meantime, was quietly abandoned. Synagogue copyists stopped reproducing it, and Jewish libraries allowed their existing copies to decay without replacement, and the Septuagint fell out of mainstream Judaism. Archaeological evidence supports. In desert caves used by Jewish refugees after the 1st century, like Wadi Muraba'at, the Septuagint text completely vanishes, replaced almost exclusively by Hebrew. Centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered the famous Cairo Geniza, a synagogue storage vault containing over 300,000 Jewish texts, they found a treasure trove of scripture, but the original Greek texts were almost entirely absent. Instead, scholars discovered palimpsests, parchment sheets showing the chemical removal and scraping of ancient Greek translation texts, completely overwritten and replaced with Hebrew literature and liturgical poems. Jewish archives show that its scribes had abandoned the Septuagint entirely to the hands of the Christian Church. As the 3rd century dawned, the conflict shifted from a war of words to a war of physical survival. Under Diocletian, the Roman state launched its most systematic attempt yet to eradicate the Christian movement. Churches were destroyed, believers imprisoned, and imperial edicts ordered Christian scriptures to be surrendered and burned in public squares. Because biblical codices were among the most visible and valuable possessions of Christian communities, copies of the Septuagint were swept up alongside New Testament writings in the campaign against Christian books. Church records tell of the traditores, or those who handed over, Christians who broke under torture and surrendered sacred texts to the authorities. Others preferred to choose imprisonment, exile, or even death. If the Septuagint and the Christian writings were to survive, they had to go underground. Driven into hidden rooms, private attics, and remote safe houses, Christian communities continued to record the text in secret. Scribes worked under the constant threat of persecution, knowing that a single knock on the door could mean their execution. Under the dim glow of flickering oil lamps, they copied massive texts page by page onto whatever materials they could find. Archaeologists have even found 3rd century fragments of the Septuagint copied onto the backs of recycled tax receipts. Every line they traced, an act of defiance against the empire. Popular myth often claims these books were written inside the dark Roman catacombs, but archaeology reveals a different truth. While the catacombs were spaces for burial rather than hidden factories, the early Christians left their mark on the stone walls. There, surrounded by the bodies of their martyrs, they recorded stories from the Bible in painted form. The catacombs might not be where the literal Septuagint and New Testament were copied, but they recount its story in paint, leaving behind a legacy of Christians and martyrs who died to keep its memory alive. But as the church emerged from the underground, the Septuagint faced a new form of persecution, the question of legitimacy. Early church fathers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Origen described repeated challenges to their Septuagint readings from Jewish interlocutors and rabbinic traditions. Justin Martyr recounted a vivid debate with a Jewish scholar named Trypho, who flatly rejected the Christian translation of Isaiah 7:14. While Justin argued the text prophesied a virgin birth, Trypho maintained it simply meant young woman, comparing the narrative to a pagan myth. Stronger yet, Irenaeus fiercely accused Aquila of Sinope of textually scrubbing these exact messianic prophecies. In Isaiah 7:14, the Septuagint's predictive word, parthenos, meaning virgin, was replaced by Aquila with neonis, or young woman. In Psalm 22, the phrase, "they pierced my hands and feet," was changed to "they disfigured," and in later revisions, "they bound." In Psalm 40, the line, "a body you have prepared for me," was changed to read, "my ears you have dug open." In his letter to Africanus, Origen documented his profound frustration regarding these debates. He complained that Jewish critics would routinely mock and dismiss Christian arguments simply by appealing to the underlying Hebrew readings, giving no credence to the Greek text. While the alternative responses to these debates are difficult to track, Jewish historical traditions corroborate this increasingly hostile view toward the Septuagint. Mainstream rabbis maintained the firm case that the rabbinical Hebrew tradition was the original Hebrew tradition, and that God's divine word must be understood exclusively through Hebrew. This challenge of legitimacy ultimately led to the most devastating blow the Septuagint would ever receive. Far more destructive than Roman fires or Jewish polemics, it came from within the very heart of the Christian church itself. By the late 4th century, Western Europe was rapidly forgetting how to read Greek. The common language of the Western Empire was now Latin. The monk Jerome was commissioned by Pope Damasus I to create a definitive, standardized Latin Bible. Initially, Jerome began translating directly from the Greek Septuagint, but as he compared the Greek text with the Hebrew manuscripts of his day, he grew increasingly frustrated with the differences. The chronological timelines didn't match. The phrasing was wildly divergent. To solve the mystery, Jerome took an extremely controversial path, one that would have been considered an absolute scandal had anyone at the time discovered it. He began secretly studying Hebrew with a Jewish rabbi named Bar Aninas. Night after night, by the dim glow of a single candle, the rabbi tutored the monk. Through these secret lessons, Jerome became convinced that the rabbinic Hebrew text was the pure, uncorrupted original, and that the church's Septuagint was flawed compared to its Hebrew counterpart. Convinced by his Jewish teachers, Jerome came to a decision that would forever alter the course of Western history. He championed a new concept, Hebraica Veritas, the Hebrew truth. Defying fierce protests from church fathers like Augustine, Jerome's Latin Vulgate largely abandoned the Septuagint in favor of a Hebrew textual tradition that had been formally standardized within Rabbinic Judaism over the centuries following Christ, a tradition scholars now call the proto-masoretic text. Jerome's decision to favor the Hebrew text over the Septuagint didn't just spark intellectual debates, it ignited fierce controversy throughout the Christian world. St. Augustine wrote anxious letters to Jerome, warning him that the new translation was causing turmoil in the churches. Augustine detailed a remarkable incident in North Africa. A local bishop had stood before his congregation and begun reading Jerome's new Latin translation of the Book of Jonah. For centuries, Christians had been taught that Jonah sat beneath the shade of a gourd, but Jerome, translating directly from the Hebrew, replaced the familiar gourd with ivy. The moment the bishop read the new wording, the congregation erupted in protest. The church descended into chaos as worshippers accused him of corrupting the sacred text they had known all their lives. According to Augustine's letter 71, local Jews had to be brought in to settle the controversy. But when they consulted their scrolls, they sided with the old Septuagint, declaring Jerome's translation to be wrong. Augustine later cited the episode as proof that even the translation of a single plant could throw an entire congregation into turmoil. Despite the pushback, Jerome's text became the Latin Vulgate. It spread across Europe and grew to dominate Western Christianity for the next 1,500 years. For most of the Western world, the Septuagint vanished from sight, dismissed as a lesser, authoritative relic. Only the eastern portion of the Church, which later became the Eastern Orthodox after the Great Schism of 1054, was an exception, maintaining the Septuagint as its primary text for the next millennium. While Western Europe fell into the localized chaos of the early Middle Ages, the Septuagint found an impenetrable sanctuary in the East, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. For 1,000 years, as waves of Avars, Persians, and Arab caliphates smashed against the city's legendary walls, the Eastern Roman Empire stood its ground. And inside those walls, the ultimate survival project of the Septuagint began. The defense of the text shifted from generals to monks. In remote, fortified monastic bastions like Mount Athos and St. Catherine's in the Sinai Desert, the scriptorium became a battlefield. Isolation was their shield. While the surrounding empires rose and fell, generations of anonymous monks labored for years in the scriptoria, copying and preserving the Greek Old Testament by hand. This was not outside its own separate struggles, however. In the 8th and 9th centuries, the iconoclastic controversies tore Byzantium apart. As emperors enforced policies against religious images, monasteries, major centers of manuscript production, were often suppressed. While the conflict centered on icons rather than biblical texts, the instability contributed to the loss and displacement of its manuscripts, as monks in some regions sought to preserve their libraries in safer monastic communities. To adapt to the pressures of limited resources, the text underwent a major technical change in the 9th century, the invention of minuscule script. Before this, Bibles were written in majuscule, giant, capital block letters that required massive amounts of expensive animal skins. Minuscule introduced a smaller, more fluid hand, allowing scribes to copy text much more efficiently, speeding up production and reducing costs. This linguistic breakthrough significantly increased the output of biblical manuscripts across the Greek-speaking world, significantly aiding the transmission of the Septuagint text. The final hour of the Byzantine fortress arrived on May 29, 1453, the fall of Constantinople. The Ottoman forces breached the walls, bringing centuries of Roman imperial rule to an end. In the aftermath of the city's capture, Constantinople was subjected to widespread looting, and the intellectual world of Byzantium scattered. In the following years, surviving scholars fled westward, carrying with them precious Greek manuscripts and knowledge of ancient Greek texts that would help keep alive the textual heritage of antiquity. These refugee scholars arrived on the shores of Italy, carrying precious Greek manuscripts and a millennium of learning into Western Europe. Their arrival helped to reignite the flames that fueled the Renaissance and laid the foundation of the Protestant Reformation. For the first time in a millennium, Western European scholars increasingly looked beyond the Latin Vulgate, engaging directly with the Greek scriptures of the early Church. The Dark Ages had failed to erase them. Even still, for centuries, history seemed to vindicate Jerome and rabbinic scholars. Many Western biblical scholars assumed that the proto-masoretic Hebrew tradition that sourced the Vulgate preserved the original wording of the prophets more faithfully than the Septuagint, which was often dismissed as a less authoritative translation. However, When the Dead Sea Scrolls were unrolled, they revealed a startling discovery. Before the 1st century, multiple Hebrew texts circulated side by side. For nearly 1,500 years, scholars believed the Septuagint was the corrupt text. The Dead Sea Scrolls forced scholars to consider the opposite possibility. In many places, the Septuagint had preserved readings older than the Hebrew Bible used by Jewish rabbis in the medieval West. Look at the physical evidence of the Samuel scroll, designated 4Q Samma. In our standard Bibles, a massive paragraph is completely missing from the 11th chapter of the first book of Samuel, making the narrative disjointed and confusing. But inside the desert caves, a 1st century BC Hebrew manuscript recovered that missing paragraph word for word, preserving the same reading found in the Septuagint. Consider Deuteronomy 32:43. The Septuagint version directed praise alongside his people and included the phrase, "Let all the angels of God worship him," a passage quoted in Hebrews 1:6 as worship towards the Messiah. Many critics argued this reading could not have belonged in the original Hebrew text. But inside Qumran Cave 4, the Hebrew scroll 4Q was pulled from the dust. It contained that exact lost line in original, pre-Christian Hebrew, or Psalm 22:16. For generations, Jewish rabbis claimed that Christian translators had altered the Hebrew text from "like a lion are my hands and feet" to read "they pierced my hands and feet" to affirm the crucifixion. Yet, in a desert cave at Nahal Hever, archaeologists unrolled a pre-Christian Hebrew scroll of the Psalms. Under electronic magnification, the text revealed a defining millimeter of ink, a long, descending Hebrew letter Vav instead of a short hooked yod, explicitly spelling out karu, "they pierced." Once again, the evidence aligned with the Septuagint reading over the Masoretic tradition. These physical discoveries, alongside many others, shattered a millennium of textual bias. Many of the Septuagint's alleged errors and mistranslations were not errors at all, but a hard-fought preservation of a more ancient Hebrew textual tradition, one that had been lost for nearly 2 millennia. The implications were staggering. The 72 Jewish translators in Alexandria hadn't changed the Bible at all. Jesus and the apostles hadn't misquoted their text. Christian copyists in safe houses hadn't forged prophecies. Martyrs hadn't protected their Bibles for nothing. Early church fathers weren't stubbornly misquoting a lesser tradition. They had all meticulously and painstakingly preserved an ancient Hebrew textual tradition that had at one time been the golden standard of ancient Judaism, a textual tradition that would have vanished if not for their sacrifice. Passed from Jewish hands to Christian scribes, saved from Roman fires, preserved by the light of hidden lamps, and hidden away in the silence of desert caves, the Septuagint didn't just survive history. It weathered storms and fought a 2 millennia-long battle to shine its light upon man today. And it tells us a story. It gives us a reminder that no matter how heavily darkness desires to obscure light, if there remain those willing to defend it, light will prevail.